Okay, let's dive into one of the most dramatic and honestly most controversial ideas in some circles of modern Christianity, the pre-tribulational rapture. You've probably seen it in movies or read about it in books, this idea that has sparked intense debate for decades. So what exactly is it, and where in the world did this idea even come from? We're going to break it all down.
Now, you might be thinking, who said that? Some critic? But get this, that quote actually comes from the source speaker himself, and he's a huge advocate for this very doctrine. He calls it preposterous right up front, because he knows that the whole idea of people suddenly vanishing from Earth can sound, well, pretty bizarre. That kind of honesty kind of makes you lean in, right? It makes you wonder, what is this belief that even its own supporters admit sounds so strange? Well, it all starts with a single Greek word, harpazo. This is the word that rapture is based on, and it means to be forcibly caught up and taken out. And that's key. It doesn't just mean to leave. It means to be snatched away, suddenly and powerfully. So here's our game plan to unpack all of this. First, we'll look at why it's called a preposterous doctrine. Then we'll explore its surprising connection to an ancient wedding promise. We'll get into what caught up in the air actually means, tackle the huge difference between the rapture and the second coming, and finally, we'll wrap up with something called the doctrine of imminence. All right, so where did this whole idea come from? Well, if you ask its proponents, they'll tell you this isn't some newfangled invention. They argue it's actually rooted in a very specific promise made by Jesus himself way back in the New Testament. That core promise is right there in the book of John, chapter 14. Jesus says, "I will come again and receive you unto myself." Now, people who hold to this doctrine see this as a literal, specific promise. And for them, the most important detail is how he returns, not all the way to the earth, but to receive believers to himself, up in the air. Okay, so to really understand the why and the how of this event, the source material points to this really fascinating parallel from history. The argument is that if you want to understand the rapture, you first have to understand the 5 steps of an ancient Galilean wedding. And this 5-step model is seen as a direct blueprint. So, step 1, the betrothal, that's like a believer's redemption. Step 2, the groom leaves to prepare a home. That directly mirrors the promise from John 14 we just talked about. And just like the bride has to be ready at all times, believers are told to expect a surprise return. It all leads up to that final marriage supper, with every single step mapping perfectly onto the theological relationship between Christ and the church. So, if that wedding analogy explains the why, what about the how? How is this event supposed to actually happen? Let's dig into the mechanics of how this all is described. This is where we get the core description from the book of 1 Thessalonians. It says believers will be caught up, and there's that word harpazo again, to meet the Lord in the air. This is a huge distinction for this belief system. The meeting place is not on the ground, it's above the earth. And we're not talking about some slow, gentle float upwards. No way. Another passage in 1 Corinthians says this change will happen in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. Now, the source material takes this phrase very, very literally. So just how fast is that really? Okay, get ready for this, because the source offers a super specific and, frankly, kind of wild interpretation here. He argues that the twinkling of an eye isn't just a poetic way of saying really fast. He claims it's a reference to the shortest possible unit of time that physics can even measure, a fraction of a second so small it's almost impossible to imagine. The whole point is to drive home that this transformation is truly, absolutely instantaneous. All right, this next part is maybe the most important piece of the entire puzzle. A lot of people hear about Jesus returning and just lump it all into one big event. But in this view, the rapture and the second coming are 2 totally separate events with different timelines and different purposes. Getting this distinction is key. So let's just ask it straight up. Is the rapture the same thing as the second coming? Well, according to this framework, the answer is a big, emphatic no. They are not the same. And confusing the two is probably the single biggest misunderstanding people have about this topic. Let's put them side by side. In the rapture, Jesus comes for his believers, and he meets them up in the air. He's presented as an imminent, any-moment event that happens before a prophesied time of wrath on earth. The second coming, on the other hand, is when Jesus returns with his believers, coming all the way down to the earth. It follows very specific, predicted signs, and it happens after that time of wrath is over. See? Totally different. So that whole idea that the rapture is a signless event that could happen at any second, that leads us to our final big concept. And this isn't just some dusty theological term, it's a belief that's meant to completely change how you live your life every single day. It's called the doctrine of imminence.
What the doctrine of imminence boils down to is this: the rapture is next on the prophetic to-do list. There are no other prophecies that have to happen first. That means it could happen today, it could happen tomorrow, or 100 years from now. But the point is, it could always be next.
So what's the practical point of all this? Well, the idea is to create this constant state of readiness and hopeful expectation. Proponents say it makes you ask yourself, hey, am I living in a way I'd be happy with if this happened right now? But here's what's crucial. It's not a call to quit your job and head for the hills. It's a command to occupy, to be busy, to be productive, right up until that moment arrives. So, when you put all these pieces on the table, the promise, the wedding analogy, the meeting in the air, and the idea that it could happen any second, you finally get to the big "so what" of the rapture in this whole theology. It's basically framed as a divine rescue mission, a Harpazo designed to snatch believers off the earth right before a prophesied period of global catastrophe that's known as the Tribulation.
And in the end, this entire really complex doctrine with all its parts, from ancient wedding customs to modern physics, it's all designed to funnel down to one very personal, very direct question for anyone who believes it. Given that this could happen at any moment, are you ready? It's a question that shapes the entire worldview for millions, making that preposterous doctrine a profound daily reality.